Yeah, okay, cool. So, hi guys, my name's Nicholas Mayne, and I'm going to talk to you guys about Orchard vNext. No. Well, hush you. So, life as we know it. We have a CMS, we have Orchard. I don't know what this slide is meant to represent, as in terms of a psychic barber, but as I Googled CMS, it came up for some reason. I'm not sure. I mean, it's kind of good. It's, you guys are here, you're using it, I hear good things. But there's some things that we could have done better. So this is Piotr last night, maybe. It's the only slide I've got. That was pretty funny. Basically, we have some pain points. We want to address them. Nhibernate. And the way that we query databases. We have 4 different ways of querying a database through Nhibernate. Really? We've got, okay, so this is my only weird business slide. I couldn't find any good slides, any good pictures to do with coupling. But we have a lot of coupling in our systems. A lot of subsystems that talk to other subsystems that talk back to other subsystems. And it's a little bit of a mess. So we ended up with, I feel that we've ended up in the kitchen sink syndrome, where we have Orchard.framework, you opt into everything, quite literally everything. You reference it, you have the abstractions, you also have the implementations. Yeah. So someone said, Nick, you're crazy, it's not that big, what are you worried about? So, list of subsystems. We have logging, log4net, that's baked in, can't change that out. We have dependency injection, so autofac, again, yeah, kind of baked in. MVC, WCF, Web API, all pretty much baked in. And Hibernate, we've got 3 different database providers in the framework. Content management, I know people who don't want Orchard as a content management system. They want to be able to use it as something else. Trying to take that out, well, I've tried, and it's hard. Oh, sorry, there's more. You've got migrations, events. Someone took out events and put it as a NuGet package. They spent the time to do that. We should spend the time to do that and make it easy. So we can do better. We have to. We want to. Orchard. I hate the name. I never wanted it. I wanted Orchard vNext, but I asked for a repository, and that's what I got given, Orchard. So Orchard 2.0. So that man in the front started it last year. Taylor did a presentation on vNext, and I was like, what? We've got to try this stuff, man. I then spoke to Sebastian, and he said, well, it requires a complete rewrite. And I was like, yeah, right. But it is a different world completely. I don't know how many people have actually loaded up the ASP.NET vNext framework and taken a stab around. Yeah? Okay, a few of you guys. Yeah, it's very, very different. So, first thing we wanted to do is we wanted to build it on the vNext platform. That was pretty much an obvious goal. But where do we start? I spoke to Sebastian, and he gave me 2 goals to start with as a proof of concept. This was quite important because, first off, if we can't get something started on the vNext platform, then we can't really use it, and we have to then say, well, right, talk to the ASP.NET team. They need to then go away and try to look at our scenario, and then, yeah. So, the 2 goals. First one, which was quite key, was multi-tenancy. A lot of you guys use multi-tenancy. I certainly know OneStop use multi-tenancy quite heavy. So we need to be able to support it. Modularity. I mean, you open up that modules folder, you've got modularity. That's a fundamental building block of Orchard, right? So some of these slides don't have pictures. I couldn't find them at 12:30 a.m. this morning when I was writing these slides, but yeah. Multi-tenancy. So we had some challenges with that. One is routing or routing, however you guys say it around the world. And the other one is how to make it so that your services are just for that request. Sorry, not just for that request, but for that tenant. So, routing's just middleware these days. We just create our own. And I'll demo a lot of this a little later on. Services. So, with the vNext pipeline, you have the ability to set your services per application and also per request scope, which is quite cool. It means that just on that request, I want this service, which is really cool if you want to say, well, okay, so this URL comes in for this shell. I want to set these services for this shell. Carry on. Bam, you got multi-tenancy. Modularity. So the second goal. Where do we go? Okay. So first off, we quite heavily rely on what's called the build manager in system.web. That does not exist at all. So how do we even load modules? It took me about 3 to 4 months to get this to work. And then I got it to work, and about a week later, David Fowler rewrote it. And I had to go back to the game plan. This happened about 5 times, actually. So it's tough. You know, those guys are iterating all the time. So, you know, we're sticking on the very tip of the vNext platform. So when I kick up the project, I bootstrap the entire thing from scratch, and away I go. So I make sure that I'm on the latest, but that comes with pain, a lot of pain, but some good stuff as well. Yeah, so there's nothing out of the box, so I had to write my own dynamic module loader. But once that was done, that was good. Proof of concept done. Where do we want to go? Where do we want to go to next? So we need more goals. So this time, I chose the goals. After speaking to Bertrand, he gave me some ideas about some other things. But one of the key goals that I wanted was core CLR compliancy. And what that means is that, so I work with a lot of guys who use Macs, and they're moving away from C# on to other things because it's so difficult to work with, with stuff on the Mac that is C#, unless you're using Mono. So I wanted to make sure that Orchard ran on a Mac and was able to deploy to Linux, just as Bertrand said in the keynote, and that you can use nice tools like OmniSharp and all those kind of things, which is really cool. The second is separating storage and query. I mentioned this in the keynote, and this is a really interesting goal. They're not the same thing, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And the third one, which is a little bit controversial, sorry Sultan and Benedek, but we broke up the framework. And I'll show that when I do a demo. So first, core CLR compliant. Let's go cross-platform. Let's develop on a Mac or a Linux. Second, separating storage and query. Again, they aren't the same. So storing a piece of content, the way we're trying to think of it is, we don't really care where it's stored, just as long as you can retrieve it. Okay, so you see EF content store there. Just ignore the fact that it says EF. It's an implementation detail. Don't worry about that. So we created an interface or an abstraction called content store or iContent store. That's an abstracted content store. So what that means is you can create an implementation of iContent store, maybe an XML content store or an entity framework in memory content store, or I don't know, any kind of content store that you want. Where you store your data, we don't care. Just that's up to you. Oh, and also we made it async. So asynchronous. I don't know why query's not async. I'm not sure. So yeah, so you choose where to store your data or your content. Do you want it on a file system? Well, that's up to you. Do you want it in Elasticsearch? Well, again, as I mentioned earlier. So querying. So the idea behind querying is that you don't want to be querying a database. It's a bit slow sometimes. You want to be querying something that's quick, like Elasticsearch or Lucene. As Sebastian showed yesterday, Lucene's pretty damn quick. So we want to be able to say, OK, when I do a query, that query is going to hit an index. It's going to retrieve me my IDs. It's going to go to the database, go to my content store. Sorry, not my database. Go to my content store, retrieve those records, and done. Yeah. But we don't want to call it, we don't want to have to do all of this ourselves. So we've created something called a content storage manager. So again, that calls an index, gets IDs. It calls all the content stores that you have. So you can have more than one content store, so multiple. And the first one that comes out, so if I pass it an ID of 5, and it fires against all the content stores, the first one out will win, which means that so if SQL Server is slower than, I don't know, what other provider you guys have got, the first one comes out, that's what you've got. So I keep saying, we don't care where you store it. That's true. But we kind of need to know what you're going to store, kind of. So we like documents. This is something very similar to InfoSet. This is kind of a little bit of an abstraction of InfoSet, or the way InfoSet works. So what InfoSet does is it takes a whole bunch of properties, serializes them into JSON, into a data attribute, and then stores them into that column in SQL Server. If you open up your SQL Server instance and look at content item version record, I think it is, you'll see a data column. And so what we want to do is do the same thing. So you'll have implementations of storage document that you pass down, and if you want to turn what you store into XML or JSON and put it into the data thing, then that's absolutely fine. It's just that the content stores need to know about something. String might not be the right thing. Maybe that needs to change to object later on, but whatever. So one of the drawbacks or benefits, or I'm not sure how we want to look at this one, is the transaction per request model is gone. So we've kind of had a bit of a blanket where if I make a mistake when trying to store something and it throws an exception, then it rolls everything back. The transaction manager rolls everything back. With multiple content stores, that's a little bit harder to do. We could implement something that does that, but the content stores would have to subscribe to it, and maybe that's the way to do it. I'm not sure. I haven't really thought of a design to that. But at the moment, if you load up Brochard or Orchard vNext, or however we want to call it, that doesn't exist. So bear that in mind. The next part. So we have a nice thing called orchard.web, and that talks to the framework and does a lot of stuff. Actually, orchard.web doesn't do much. Orchard.framework does a lot of stuff. So what I've done is I've said, OK, well, let's split that into client and host. So client, it's basically your orchard.web, as I said a second ago. You tell the framework You tell the framework where to get your modules and themes and so on and so forth from. And I'll show you how to do that as well. And it's so easy, like so easy. And then you also tell the host what to do. So your orchard.web or food.bar or whatever you want to call it can have lots of different folders or whatever in it, and you just tell the host where they are. You're in control. And then the host, okay, so this line's a little bit wrong, but the host is the separation between kind of the web stuff and the console stuff. So we have orchard.exe that lives in our bin folder. Well, that's nice, but we don't need that anymore. We want that in our orchard.web. So we want to just call orchard.web, and that will kick up a host. Not sure how that's going to play out, but that's the separation at the moment. And the host then configures the core. So you've got 3 levels of configuration that go down, and the core is quite bare. So there's a lot of configuration that goes on in there. So this is Brochard. All right, so time for a demo. All right, so I've got everything in OneNote. Well, I've got code, and I've got OneNote to remind me what I'm doing. So I'm going to be jumping back and forth a little bit. Okay. So I spoke about composition. I spoke about splitting up the framework earlier. And so here it is as it stands. All right. Just load up. You guys can see that okay? Okay. First, we have a client, orchard.web. Oh, man. Now we've got an awful lot of packages. So this is the framework split up, essentially. So I spoke about host earlier. So we have our web host and we have our console host. And those are implementations of orchard.hosting. Yeah. So let me just jump back. Host. Cool. Right. So the first, for God's sake. All right, I'll have to type it out. So the first thing we looked at doing, I said earlier, was multi-tenancy. So if I show you that, container. So that's using middleware. If I just minimize that and scroll down. 18. Can you see? It's 18. No. Bigger?
No discussion. Tools, options, 18. Or you don't see. Tools.
Tools.
Tools menu. Options. Editor fonts, 18. Thank you.
That one, yeah?
They can see. It's code they have to read. No resolution, sorry.
I'm going to go with that one. I'm going 16. 18? What?
Yours is 6040 by 480 or something like that.
Yeah, I put it up so that you guys could see. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, multi-tenancy. So the first thing that we needed to do was we needed to set our services for our particular shell. And that was actually pretty simple. So what we do is we go off and get our shell settings using our request host. And then using the shell settings class that you guys are all quite used to, we then create a shell context off Orchard host, pretty much the same APIs that exists, that gives us back a lifetime scope. It's not called a real lifetime scope. It's not an autofact lifetime scope. It's a iService provider, which is more like that's the vNext kind of container. And then what we do is we set that on the request. So when you make a call in, we take all the services, we put them on the request, bam, you've got a tenant. And then the next part is we have routing middleware. So there is a default router middleware in vNext, except it doesn't work quite the way we want it to. We do some funky stuff in Orchard. So all this is really doing is it's getting a route builder, and it's just setting the routes on it, and away you go. And that's per request. So the middleware goes container middleware, and then it goes router middleware. So you kind of you have it stacked, which is quite cool. So the second part was modular. Cool, it selects. Is modularity. So I'm just I've got a module called orchard.demo. So one thing I'm not meant to do is change the project.json file, because I don't want it to pull any latest sources down, or else I'm just nothing will work. Maybe. So some of the cool things that we've got in Orchard is the ability to have module.txt manifest files and be able to describe your modules and not have the framework know about them. So you don't want to load up Orchard every time you got a new module and say, reference that module. You just want to load it up. You want to go into your view, into your features and say enable. So we achieve that. So we have pretty much exactly the same as what you have before. So this is just a regular module.txt file, which is great. The only difference is there's a project.json file that is your replacement for references. And so we load up these modules using your I extension loader. So exactly what we do before. So the next is core CLR. Okay. So with core CLR, hold on, let me just content part. Okay. So with core CLR, that gives us, like I said earlier, the distinct advantage to be able to compile once, run on any platform. That means that we have a few things that we have to do in order to make this work. A few things are processor directives. So we have to specify, so if I compile, the compiler will run one for the .NET framework, and then another one for the DNX core, the core CLR. And it will give you warnings or errors based on either. And you may not want to use a using statement for one, but you may want to use that using statement for another, or you may want to use different parts of code for one and different parts of code for another. So this is the way that, that we do that. And in the project.json file, we have the frameworks specified here. So we have the DNX for 4.1, and we have the core. So X document is not available from the regular framework, so we have to bring that in, but just for the core. We don't need it for everything else. Okay, let me just bring this back a little bit. Okay, so the next big one is separating storage and query. So we have a new module called, or like not so much a module, but we have a new package called orchard.data. So that contains the abstractions for our storage and for our query. So I said that we split them up. We basically split them up using interfaces. Let me just minimize that. We don't care about that. And Entity Framework is, in this instance, I'm not saying that we're going to be using Entity Framework in the future, but it was the only core CLR compliant database that was out there at the time. So it made sense to use it. So I mentioned iContent Store earlier, and iContent Storage Manager. So I'm going to drill down into this stuff in a second. I'm going to be jumping around a little bit. So let me just close those. Okay, home controller. But you guys are all used to talking directly to the content manager and using content items. Great. Nothing's changed. It looks exactly the same as it was before. I set a property. I create a content type. I set a property. I create that on my content manager, I get that back, and then I pass it to a view. Wow, it looks exactly the same. Nick, what have you done? So, as I said earlier, we've got a content store. Content store has an implementation. So if I show you the implementation of that, in this instance, entity framework, which is an implementation. So that's a module in its own right. So if you want another one, you create another module of orchard.data.xml or whatever, and you implement your content store. And that's as easy as it is. It doesn't cover every scenario yet, but it's early days, right? And we have okay. So you don't want to call the content manager. So because you have many content stores, you want to be able to call them just once, or you want to be able to call something once to get, as I mentioned, first out. So we have the content storage manager for that. Okay, okay. And here we have the get method. So if I have an ID of 1, for example, then that's going to fire off against, and I'm new to async stuff, so if you guys see anything wrong with my async code, please tell me. But what this is doing is it's firing off asynchronously to all the content stores. It's then ordering by the completion. So, if this one finishes, if this one fired off last but finished first, then that would be the first one returned. And I'm just taking the first one where the result is returned and just going back. So, you don't care about slow storage anymore. You just care about the first one. Yeah, so I noticed a for each async earlier, and that's in C#7, and that's where this could be taken into account. Absolutely. I'm not sure how that would work with order by completion. That's something that I think maybe we need, but yeah, I mean, it's very cool. It's very cool. Okay, so the next part is so querying. So you want to be able to query by a Lambda expression. So one of the things that we were looking at doing was I mentioned earlier maybe something about a map. So we're looking at MapReduce, the MapReduce pattern. So the MapReduce pattern's not fully baked in the way I want it to be baked in yet. But let me show you a way of using it. So you have a query that you pass in a map. Oops, it's jumping around a bit. Let me just move over. So you pass in a map lambda. That will then query the index store and return you what's called a content index result. So it will return you a list of records, and what you can then do is you can then reduce that list of records even further down. I'm not going to show that because I'm not quite happy with the implementation yet, but that's the concept. Once you can reduce that down, then you can have bigger indexes, reduce things down, get data back much nicer. Yeah, it's quite cool. So the next part is okay. Right, so I mentioned earlier about breaking up the orchard.framework. So all these things that you guys are looking at here are NuGet packages. So, I mean, they're not NuGet packages in the sense that, they just look like regular packages. But when I build them, I deploy them to myget, and they become NuGet packages. You guys can reference them. That's really cool. You reference them like NuGet packages. So in your project.json file, for example, I can say here that I just want to reference a version of orchard.data, or I want to reference a version of orchard.abstractions, and so on and so forth. And it's a much nicer way to deal with the pain of versioning. Oh yeah, of course, I'm in the package. Content.management. Wow, it's a package in its own right. If you don't want it, you don't need it. if you don't need it, sorry, then you don't have to have it. And last thing is configuration. So I mentioned earlier about being able to configure your host. So if I open up the orchard.web, you have a class called startup. So that's quite indicative of middleware. Of the new world. Everything starts up using a startup CS file. And if I, oops. So I want to be able to add a module folder. There you go. There you go, module folder. So services.add module folder. I don't need to mess around with the core anymore. I can just say, I want a folder called modules, and that lives there. If I want a folder called foo, I do exactly the same and create a folder called foo. And it will look in that folder for those modules. The same thing when we implement themes, we'll have add themes folder. And it gives you guys the power to say, well, okay, I want my core module separated away from my main, from the modules that I know about. So the next part is I spoke about it configures the web host. So if I scroll down, go into that, this is configuring all the internal services. So orchard.hosting.web knows about a lot of the individual packages. It has a lot of things specified in it. So it knows about the implementation detail rather than the abstraction detail because it needs to be able to set these things up. And what I've done is, similar to the way the ASP.NET team set up their services per package, I've done exactly the same. So if I want an extension manager specified, then I have an extension method registering just my extensions. Just my extensions for the extension manager that live inside of my package orchard.environment.extensions. The names of the packages, let's not worry too much about because they'll probably change a bit. But the concept is, if you want it, you subscribe to it. You're not going to get everything for free if you don't want it. Same with the web file system and logging, and yep. So that's pretty cool. And then this is just passing a lambda down to the add host. So we have a big thing called orchardstarter.cs in our regular Orchard project. This is what it looks like now. Oops. So very small. Not really much to it, which is, I think, quite cool. Yeah. Back to my slides. All right. So, contributors. We've had 6. However, 103 stars. 50 probably spam. I'm not going to rule that out. But it's a third of what Orchard has at the moment. So it's only a small project, but it's still growing. I want to help. Cool, so we have a list. It's on the site. That list is being maintained by me, but there's checkboxes and cool stuff. So some of the challenges that I faced, well, I made the choice to stick to the tip of DNX, which was interesting. I said 4 rewrites. It was about a week ago. Something changed. So, yeah. And finding external NuGet packages that are core CLR compliant, that is not easy. Not easy at all. One of the goals I didn't mention is that I didn't want to use any external packages apart from the ones that Microsoft published themselves. That worked out very well up until I needed a YAML parser. So I had to write my own. Not my own YAML parser. Luckily, there was a package that was core CLR compliant that I could plug into a package called, and if you guys want to use this in your own projects, then please feel free. Called orchard.parser.yaml, parser.yaml, and it uses the YAML.NET library. But it has no references to anything in Orchard. So if you want to use it, you can just reference the NuGet package and use it. That easy. So find out more. And that's my talk done.
You said that you're not going to deprecate nhibernate as the...
You choose. If you want nhibernate, create a content store.
But is the core of Orchard going to be running on Entity Framework instead, or...?
We haven't made any decisions around what we're going to provide as a default provider yet. There's a few that I've been looking at, but they're not core CLR compliant. So, for example, I looked at Dapper and looks great, and it kept up to a point. So I think it was on DNX or the beta 6, I think, at one point. But I was already on 8. So just going back is very difficult.
Yeah.
I can't just wait around. So once those guys catch up, then maybe I'll look at implementing a content store for that.
I think the main question here is, I don't want several different kind of frameworks running towards the database because it's too much overhead. So I don't want an Orchard installation with Entity Framework and Hibernate and Dapper. I want to pick one.
They're Orchard features. Turn it on, turn it off. That's up to you.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so you're in control, man.
So it's, but I need to write my own middleware then to control it?
No, so we'll provide one out of the box for you that you can turn on. But if you wanted a way to extend that, then you can extend that easily. And that's kind of what I was trying to hint at. Not that we'll give you something and you have to go do it. I'm not saying that. It's just going to be very similar to the way Orchard does it at the moment. You fire up Orchard, it saves data. Exactly the same, but if you want to extend it, you can. Much more easier.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Sounds good.
Yeah? Cool. Microphone. Oh.
Cheers. Good job, Nick. You mentioned finding core NuGet packages was hard.
Yes.
Is that because discoverability of those is hard, or because there aren't many to find yet?
There aren't that many to find. So you can go into your project.json file and type out the NuGet package, and it will install, but it won't install. It will only work for like maybe the not the core CLR, the other one. What's it called? Yeah, the DNX 451. But then you'll have warnings with the core CLR, so it won't work. And I don't want that. I want it to work for both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just so you know as well, when you're looking at those, we're starting a big push right now to try and get more packages to start picking up core. Now it's starting to stabilize.
Yeah.
That's going to, on about the middle of October, that's going to ramp up activity,
fantastic.
so there should be more. If there are others, then do drop me a line, Martin Woodward. Me and Daniel Roth are probably going to drive a lot of that.
Fantastic. Cool.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something about the default content store that we'll have in vNext. There might actually be more than one, where you might have one relational database container, and then another one that may be based on the file system or on a document database. And because you have this querying infrastructure that can query across content stores, it's actually not a big deal, and it's not going to have an impact on querying performance or even the querying API.
No. It should be pretty cool, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. It should be awesome.
Should be awesome. We hope.
Is there a roadmap on the timeline on when this guy will take over?
So I have been asked that about 12 times, I think, in about a day and a half. And at the moment, there's no timeline. Sorry. If you want to help, then yeah. But seriously, there's no timeline. I've done this on the side, so it's yeah.
Maybe one more question.
Sure.
Is it transparent from already existing modules to upgrade to this, or it's a lot of work to?
That's a very good question, actually. So is it easy to take an existing module and transplant it onto this platform? You'll need to make some changes. I showed that the content manager looks very similar, and that will probably stay to a degree. But the dependency injection stuff is a package. So you'll now need to reference that in order to get dependency, for example. So
This will
yes
be
and
mostly
no.
configuration.
Yes and no.
Yeah.
There's going to be a lot of the concepts that stay the same.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the names are going to stay the same. But there will be a lot of change as well. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
That's why it's 2.2.
Yeah, exactly. It's a breaking change. Yeah, that's why it's 2.
How are you going to handle updates to packages or to Orchard for the future? So like 2.1, for example, is it going to be something where the update pulls down and then it overwrites your changes to startup.cs, or?
So that's a very good point. So because we push out the packages at the moment to myget, so every time I check in, it does a build, pushes them out to myget with a version number. So if you want to, let's say Sebastian makes a change to one package, and Sibka changes another package, but you want Sibka's change and you don't want Sebastian's change. Well, you can just reference the version of yeah. So you can just reference his package and not his, and it should just work.
But will that overwrite my customizations to startups? Like, for example, if I'm editing a startup now?
Create your own host. Create your own client. They're the file I showed you to set up those modules, that's literally it. So you can just create your own. Yeah.
Thank you, Nick.